The rain came down like a verdict. Alara Cole stood at the edge of the gravel road headlights, cutting through the dark, and stared at the shape rising out of the mist. The barn, her father's barn, slumped and sagging against the Virginia sky like something the earth was slowly swallowing whole. The roof bowed in the middle. The doors hung crooked on their hinges. Ivy had crawled up one side and died there, brown and brittle, still clinging to the wood like it had nowhere else to go.
Like you promised.
She held the deed in her hand. One page, creased down the middle where the lawyer had folded it. Her name was on it, printed in small black letters beneath a description of the property. 5 acres of land, 1 agricultural structure. No appraised value listed. That was her inheritance. Everything else, the mansion on the hill, the vineyard stretching across the valley, the fleet of cars polished to mirrors, the investment accounts and the business holdings, all of it went to her stepbrothers. Sons of a different mother, sons of a different life. She got the barn, and the laughter that came with it. The windshield wipers beat a slow rhythm. She sat in the car for a long time watching water streak the glass, turning the barn into something blurred and ghost-like. Then she cut the engine, stepped into the rain, and walked toward it. The mud pulled at her shoes. The cold bit her arms through the thin coat she had worn to the funeral. She did not go back for an umbrella. She did not go back at all. She pushed the barn door open. The hinges screamed, and the dark swallowed her whole. 3 weeks earlier, the world had still made sense. Her father, Henry Cole, had been a tall man. Not tall in the way people say to be polite. Tall in the way that made door frames a problem and overhead lights a hazard. He had hands like shovels and a voice that could carry across a 40-acre field without raising itself above a conversational tone. He built things. Fences, barns, businesses. He built Cole Holdings from a single tractor and 60 acres of Shenandoah Valley soil into a company that owned land in 3 counties and employed over 200 people. But the thing Alara remembered most was not the empire. It was the barn. When she was 5, he would carry her on his shoulders through the wide doors, and the smell would hit her. Hay and motor oil and the warm breath of horses. He would set her down on a hay bale and whistle while he worked fixing a belt on the old John Deere or oiling the hinges on a stall gate. She would sit there for hours, legs swinging, watching him move through that space like it was a cathedral, and he was its only priest. When she was 9, he handed her a pocket knife and pointed to a beam near the back wall. "Go on," he said. "Put your mark on it." She carved her initials carefully. EC. Then he carved his beside them, HC, and between the two he cut a small plus sign. "That means we're a team," he said. "No matter what happens out there, this barn knows the truth." She had not understood then what he meant by out there. She was 9. The world was the barn and the fields and her father's wide hands lifting her toward the stars. But out there came anyway. It came in the form of Vivian Ashford, a woman with pale skin and sharp cheekbones and a smile that could charm the deed right off a man's land. She married Henry when Alara was 11. She brought 2 sons with her. Dorian, 13 at the time, already wearing his arrogance like a coat he had been fitted for at birth. And Beckett, 10, quiet and watchful, always standing slightly behind his mother, as though he were her shadow and not her child. The house changed. New furniture, new rules, new silences. Alara found herself eating dinner at a table where she increasingly felt like a guest. Vivian never raised her voice. She did not need to. She rearranged the world with suggestions, with glances, with the careful placement of words that sounded generous but landed like walls. Maybe Alara would be more comfortable in the smaller bedroom. Maybe Alara does not need to come to the company dinner. It is mostly adults. Maybe Alara should spend the summer with her aunt. Fresh air would do her good. Henry tried. Alara knew he tried. She would catch him watching her from across the room with something heavy in his eyes, something that looked like an apology he could not figure out how to speak. On weekends, when Vivian took her sons to Richmond for shopping or theater, Henry would find Alara and drive her out to the barn. Those were the good hours. the hours that smelled like hay and engine grease and honest work. He taught her to change a tire, to patch a fence, to read the sky for weather. He told her about this land, how his grandfather had worked it with mules, how his father had nearly lost it in the drought of '64, how he himself had borrowed against everything he owned to start coal holdings. This land is not just dirt, he said once, leaning against the barn door, with coffee steam rising around his face. It is memory. Every acre holds a story. And stories do not die, Alara, not if someone remembers them. She was 16 then. She thought he was being poetic. She did not know he was being precise. One afternoon that same year, while they sat on the barn roof watching the sun drop behind the Blue Ridge, Henry pointed to a spot on the barn floor below them. Right about there, he said, my granddaddy capped an old well back in the '50s. Dug it during the Depression, used it for 30 years, then sealed it with concrete when the county ran water lines out here. On a wet morning, water still seeps in through the limestone, sits about 4 feet below the slab, catches the light sometimes, like a mirror. Alara had nodded, not thinking much of it. She was 16. Old wells were not interesting. The sunset was. She would remember that conversation 10 years later, in the dark, with a brass key in her pocket and her father's handwriting burning in her mind. But that evening, it was just another story, and she let it drift away on the warm air like the rest. The years passed the way years do, unnoticed, until they are gone. Alara left for college, studied education, became a teacher at a small elementary school in Charlottesville. She visited when she could, but each visit felt shorter than the last, the house more Vivian's and less Henry's, the conversation more careful and less real. Her father aged, his tall frame bent slightly. His voice, once capable of crossing fields, grew softer. The last time she saw him, 3 months before the end, he was sitting on the porch of the farmhouse, watching the sunset over the valley. She sat beside him. You still got the barn, he said out of nowhere. She laughed. I do not think anyone else wants it, Dad. He looked at her then, and something in his gaze made her breath catch. It was not sadness. It was intention. Do not ever let them take it from you, he said. Promise me. She promised, not knowing what she was promising. He died on a Tuesday. Heart failure, the doctor said. Vivian called Alara at 7 in the morning, her voice flat and rehearsed like she had practiced the line in the mirror. Your father passed in his sleep. The funeral is Saturday. That was all. Alara drove to Shenandoah in silence. No radio, no phone calls. Just the hum of the highway and the weight of a world suddenly emptied of the one person who had made it feel like home. The funeral was held at the stone church at the edge of town, the one with the crooked steeple and the cemetery that ran along the hill behind it. The pews were full. Henry Cole had been a man people respected, even if they did not always understand him. Farmers sat beside bankers, old friends beside business partners. The whole valley turned out. Alara sat in the second row, not the first. The first row was reserved. Vivian had arranged it that way, of course. She sat at the center, flanked by Dorian and Beckett, wearing black silk in a veil that caught the candlelight. She dabbed her eyes with a handkerchief, but Alara noticed, as she always noticed, that the fabric stayed dry. Dorian sat with his arms crossed, scanning the room like he was taking attendance at a board meeting. At 33, he had become a sharper version of his mother, all angles and entitlement. He wore a suit that cost more than Alara's car and checked his phone twice during the eulogy. Beckett was different. He sat with his hands in his lap, head bowed. At one point, he turned and looked at Alara. Not a long look, just a flicker. But in it, she saw something she had not expected. Guilt. The pastor spoke of Henry's generosity, his love for the land, his devotion to family. Alara listened and thought about hay bales and pocket knives and the smell of coffee at dawn. She did not cry. She had done her crying alone in her apartment in Charlottesville with the lights off and the curtains closed where no one could see. After the burial, the family gathered in the farmhouse drawing room. The space had changed since Alara's childhood. The old oak furniture was gone, replaced by sleek, modern pieces Vivian had ordered from catalogs. The bookshelves that once held Henry's agricultural manuals now displayed decorative objects that no one had ever touched. The lawyer arrived at 2 o'clock. His name was Pembroke, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses and a briefcase that looked older than he was. He had been the family attorney for years, though Alara had always sensed, without being able to prove it, that his loyalty ran more toward Vivian than toward the truth. He cleared his throat, adjusted his glasses, opened a folder. According to the last will and testament of Henry James Cole, he began. The room leaned forward. The primary residence, including all furnishings and attached property to Dorian Ashford Cole and Beckett Ashford Cole, to be held in equal share. Dorian nodded as though confirming something he had already been told. The vineyard property and associated operations to Dorian Ashford Cole and Beckett Ashford Cole. Vivian's lips curled slightly at the edges. All vehicles, investment accounts, and liquid assets to be divided equally between Dorian Ashford Cole and Beckett Ashford Cole. A murmur rippled through the room. Not surprise, confirmation. This was what everyone had expected. The sons got the kingdom. That was how it was supposed to work. Then Pembroke paused. His eyes flicked toward Alara. She felt the weight of every gaze in the room shift to her like a spotlight. And to Alara Marie Cole, he said, his voice thinning, the agricultural structure and adjacent 5 acres of land located at the eastern edge of the Cole property, commonly known as the Old Barn. Silence. 1 second, 2, 3. Then the room broke open. Dorian laughed first. A short bark of a sound, sharp and mean. She got the barn, he said, not quite whispering. Guess Dad had a sense of humor after all. Someone behind Alara chuckled. Then another. The laughter spread quietly, politely, the way cruelty spreads when it wears a suit and tie. Vivian leaned back in her chair and folded her hands, each nail filed to a perfect point. It is symbolic, she said, her voice carrying just enough warmth to disguise the blade beneath it. Henry always said you were close to the earth, dear. I think he meant it as a compliment. Alara stared at the paper Pembroke slid across the table. 2 lines, her name. A description of a building no one wanted, signed by the same hand that had once carved initials into a wooden beam and told her they were a team. Her throat burned. Her eyes stung. But she did not cry. Not here, not in front of them. She stood. The chair scraped against the marble floor, and the sound cut through the laughter like a blade. I will take what is mine, she said. Her voice did not shake. Her eyes were wet, but steady. No one moved to stop her. She picked up the deed, folded it once, and walked toward the door. Behind her, the murmuring resumed, softer now, tinged with the particular satisfaction people feel when someone they consider beneath them receives exactly what they expected. Outside, the air hit her face like cold water. The sky was bruised and heavy clouds piling over the valley in shades of iron and ash. Thunder rolled somewhere far off, not a crack, but a slow, deep groan, like the earth clearing its throat. She walked to her car. Her shoes sank in the soft ground. Rain began to fall, light at first, then harder, streaking the windshield before she even reached the door. She sat behind the wheel and placed the deed on the passenger seat. The paper was already creased and smudged, but the words were clear. Her name, her land, her barn. For the first time that day, she smiled. Barely. All right, Dad, she whispered. Let us see what you left me. The engine turned over. The headlights swept across the wet field. She drove toward the valley, toward the barn, toward the one thing everyone else had already forgotten. By the time she reached the property, the rain had softened to a mist. The old farmhouse rose in the distance, dark and hunched, but she did not go there. She followed the gravel track, past the fence line, past the empty pasture, until the barn appeared in her headlights. It looked worse up close. The siding had warped and split. One corner of the roof had caved slightly, letting in a triangle of sky. The doors were weathered gray, the paint long gone. Weeds had grown up around the foundation like a slow green tide. She got out. The air smelled of wet hay and rust and something faintly sweet beneath it, years of oil and labor soaked into the grain of the wood. It was a smell she knew the way you know your own heartbeat, familiar, permanent, aching. She pushed the door open, the hinges groaned their ancient protest. A wave of dust rose swirling in the thin beams of light from her flashlight. Cobwebs hung from the rafters like lace curtains in a house no one had lived in for years. She stood in the doorway for a long time, just breathing, loss and memory and dust all mixed together, filling her lungs. "Looks like nobody has cared for you in a long while," she said softly. The broom she found leaning against the wall was cracked down the handle, but it still swept. She started in the corner nearest the door and worked her way inward. Each stroke stirred up ghosts, feed sacks with faded letters, rusted buckets with holes in the bottom, a broken lantern, its glass scattered like teeth. She worked through the night and into the morning. Her sleeves were rolled to the elbows. Her hair was tied back with a ribbon she had found in the glove compartment. Sweat gathered at her temples and blisters rose on her palms, and she kept going. By noon, sunlight had broken through the clouds and was pouring through the gaps in the roof, turning the dust to gold. She stopped sweeping and looked up. For a moment, the barn was beautiful. Not in the way new things are beautiful, in the way that old, honest things are beautiful when the light hits them right. "Dad," she said, shaking her head, "you really left me a project." She laughed, quietly, to herself. It was the first real sound of joy she had made in weeks, and it echoed in the empty space like a bell. Then she saw it, the beam, near the back wall low enough to touch. The wood was dark with age and warped by moisture, but the carving was still there. HC plus EC. His initials and hers joined by a cross he had cut with 3 careful strokes of a knife 20 years ago. She ran her fingers over the letters. The wood was rough and warm. Beneath the carving, she noticed something she had never seen before. The wood had splintered slightly as though something had been pried loose and then pressed back into place. Not broken, hidden. She touched the spot. There was a soft give beneath her fingers, like a drawer that had not been fully closed. Her heart quickened, but before she could press further, the sound of tires on gravel froze her. She moved quickly to the wall and peered through a gap in the boards. A white SUV had pulled up near the fence. Vivian stepped out first, immaculate as always, pressed slacks. Sunglasses pushed into her silver blonde hair. Dorian followed, jacket slung over one shoulder, surveying the land the way a man surveys something he already considers his. They did not approach the barn. They stood near the car, voices carrying clean and sharp through the still air. "She can rot out here for all I care," Dorian said. "The land is what matters, 5 acres next to the vineyard. Once she gets tired of playing farmer, we will buy it from her for nothing." Vivian tilted her head, watching the barn like she was studying an insect. He almost changed everything she said. 6 months before he died, started talking to another attorney, asking about restructuring. Pembroke handled it, got the new will signed just in time. Dorian glanced at her. "She does not suspect anything, does she?" Vivian's smile was a thin, clean line. "She is in there sweeping a floor," she said. "What do you think?" They laughed. The sound drifted across the field and slid through the cracks in the barn walls like smoke. Then they got back in the SUV and drove away. Alara did not move. She stayed crouched behind the hay bales, her hand pressed flat against the floor, her breath shallow and uneven. The words replayed in her mind like a recording she could not stop. "He almost changed everything. Pembroke handled it. Got the new will signed just in time." They had changed the will. Her father had not left her the barn as a joke. He had not forgotten her. He had tried to give her more, maybe everything, and they had stopped him. Vivian and her lawyer had rewritten the ending before Henry could finish the story. Alara was not abandoned, but she was robbed. Something shifted inside her, not anger, not yet. Something quieter and more dangerous. A door opening in her chest that she had not known was there. She stood. Her legs were stiff, her hands dirty. She walked back to the beam where the initials were carved and pressed her fingers into the splintered wood beneath them. This time she pushed. The wood gave way. A small panel no bigger than a cigar box swung inward on a hidden hinge. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, lay a brass key, heavy, cold, old. Beside it was a folded piece of paper yellowed at the edges, soft with age. She unfolded it with careful hands. Her father's handwriting. She would have known it anywhere. The strong leftward slant. The way his capital letters leaned forward like they were in a hurry. 7 words. Where the earth meets its mirror, truth waits for its keeper. She read it again and again. The words did not make sense. Not yet. But the ink was deliberate. The letters were steady. This was not a note dashed off in passing. This was a message left with purpose by a man who knew exactly what he was doing and exactly who would find it. She held the key up. The brass caught the afternoon light, and for a moment she saw her own reflection in the metal. Blurred, small, but there. She slipped the key into her pocket, folded the note and placed it beside it. Then she looked around the barn slowly this time, not as a daughter grieving, but as a woman searching. The dust, the beams, the floor, the light falling through the broken roof. Everything looked different now, not abandoned, guarded. Her father had not left her a ruin. He had left her a vault. And somewhere inside it, beneath the hay and rust, in silence, the truth was waiting. "Okay, Dad," she whispered into the still air. "What are you trying to tell me?" The wind blew through the open doorway, scattering bits of hay across the floor she had just swept, almost like an answer. Almost like a hand reaching back from somewhere she could not see, pointing her forward. She tightened her grip on the key in her pocket and walked out into the fading light. The sun was sinking behind the Blue Ridge, painting the valley in shades of copper and rust. She needed rest. She needed to think. She drove back toward town and checked into a small rental she had found the day before the funeral, a room above the hardware store on Main Street with white curtains and a ceiling fan that clicked on every third rotation. It was not much, but it was hers, and tonight she needed walls that did not belong to anyone she was fighting. She could not sleep. The note burned in her mind like a coal she could not put down. Where the earth meets its mirror. She lay on her back, staring at the dark, turning the words over and over until they wore grooves in her thinking. The earth meets its mirror, a mirror of the earth, water. She sat up. The clock on the nightstand read 1:47 in the morning. Outside, the valley was wrapped in silver mist, the kind that rolls off the Shenandoah River and settles in the low places like a slow tide of ghosts. And then, like a door swinging open in a dark hallway, she remembered. 16 years old, sitting on the barn roof, her father pointing to the floor below. "Right about there," he had said. "My granddaddy capped an old well back in the 50s. On a wet morning, water still seeps in through the limestone, sits about 4 feet below the slab, catches the light sometimes. Like a mirror. Like a mirror." Alara was already reaching for her jacket. The drive took 12 minutes. The roads were empty fog pulling in the hollows, her headlights carving tunnels through the white. She parked on the gravel and sat for a moment, engine ticking in the silence. The barn was a black shape against a blacker sky. No stars, no moon, just the outline of something waiting. She grabbed the flashlight from the glove compartment and stepped out. The air was cold enough to see her breath. Crickets pulsed in the tall grass, steady and rhythmic, like a heartbeat the valley shared. Inside the barn was colder still. Her flashlight swept across the floor over the hay bales. She had restacked the tool bench. She had wiped clean the spot near the beam where she had found the key. Everything looked the same, but she was not looking at the same things. She moved to the back of the barn, past the stalls, past the old feed bins, to the corner where the concrete floor met the wall. A set of wooden crates had been stacked there for years, heavy and awkward, the kind used for shipping engine parts. She had swept around them that first day, too tired to move them. Not tonight. She braced her shoulder against the first crate and shoved. The wood scraped against concrete, the sound sharp in the silence. She pushed the second crate, then the third. Beneath them, the floor was darker, untouched by her broom. And there, running diagonally across the slab, was a hairline crack, thin as a pencil line, easy to miss in daylight, impossible to miss when you were looking for it. She knelt and ran her fingers along the edge. The concrete was slightly raised on one side at a quarter inch at most, just enough to feel with a fingertip. She pressed her palm flat against it. It moved. Not much, a fraction, but enough to confirm what her father's note had promised. There was something beneath. She worked her fingers into the crack and pulled. The section of concrete lifted like a trap door, heavy, but balanced, hinged on a metal pin that had been sunk into the foundation. Beneath it, a breath of stale air rose to meet her, cold and damp, carrying the smell of wet soil and iron and time. Steps, narrow, wooden, disappearing into the dark. Her flashlight trembled in her hand, not from cold, from the sudden, overwhelming understanding that her father had built this, had carved these steps and dug this space and hidden it beneath a barn that everyone else considered worthless. He had done it alone in secret over years. For her, she went down. Each step creaked softly under her boots. The walls were packed earth, braced with old boards, solid and dry despite the depth. Cobwebs brushed her face. The air grew cooler with each step, and the sound of the world above the wind, the crickets, the creak of the barn faded until there was nothing but her breathing and the soft thud of her footsteps. The stairway ended. The space open. It was small. A room carved from the earth, barely 8 feet across, with a low ceiling she could touch if she raised her hand. Shelves lined 3 walls, built from the same rough pine as the barn above. On the shelves sat metal boxes sealed and labeled in a handwriting she knew better than her own. Harvest Logs 2009. Company records, insurance. The labels were written in black marker, each letter deliberate and clear. Her father's handwriting had always looked like it was leaning into the wind, as if even his penmanship was in a hurry to get somewhere. She scanned the shelves, her flashlight moving from box to box until it stopped on one near the corner. Smaller than the others. No date, no category, just a single word written across the front in letters twice the size of the rest. Alara. Her throat closed. She stood there for a long moment, the flashlight beam steady on her own name, the silence of the underground pressing against her like a hand on her chest. She lifted the box from the shelf. It was heavier than she expected. She set it on a crate that served as a table, unlatched the lid, and opened it. Folders, tied neatly with twine. Old photographs, some in black and white, some in faded color. And documents, dozens of them stamped and sealed, an official bearing the name Cole Holdings, LLC, in raised blue ink. She opened the first folder. Her hands were shaking, but she made herself read slowly. Certificate of Incorporation. Cole Holdings, LLC, State of Virginia, filed April 14th, 2009. She turned the page. Principal shareholder, Ilara Marie Cole, 62% control and interest. She read it again and again. The words did not change. Her father had created the company under her name. Not Vivian's, not Dorian's, not Beckett's. Hers. 15 years ago, when she was 13 years old, when she was still carving initials into barn beams and learning to count the stars, her father had built a fortress around everything he owned and put her name on the gate. The next folder held the trust documents. Irrevocable, structured so that the assets could not be transferred, sold, or dissolved without the consent of the principal shareholder. Her. Every piece of land, every building, every vehicle, every account that the family believed had been divided by the will actually belonged to the company. And the company belonged to Alara. The will was a shell, the barn was the vault. At the bottom of the box, beneath the folders and photographs, she found a recording device. Old. The kind with a small cassette tape inside, the sort her father had used to dictate notes when he was driving between properties. She pressed play. Static crackled. Then his voice, low, steady, familiar in a way that made the walls of the underground room feel suddenly thin, as though he were standing just on the other side of them, leaning against the dirt, talking to her the way he always had, without hurry, without pretense. If you are hearing this, it means I could not tell you in time. I am sorry for that, sweetheart. I wanted to. I planned to. But things moved faster than I expected. A pause, the faint sound of breathing. The company is yours, Alara. I built it under your name years ago. I used a separate attorney, a man Vivian and Pembroke have never met, to file everything through the State Corporation Commission. Every acre, every deed, every asset flows through Cole Holdings, and you are its heart. Your stepmother has been trying to move things for months. Accounts, titles, contracts. Pembroke has been helping her. This was the only way I could keep it safe. Trust the barn. It has always protected what mattered. His voice cracked on the last word. There was a silence, the kind that holds weight, and then he spoke again, softer now. You were always the one with heart. I knew you would find this when it mattered most. I am proud of you, Alara. I have always been proud of you. The tape clicked off. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full, heavy with years and love, and the particular kind of grief that comes not from losing someone, but from understanding too late how deeply they saw you. She sat on the crate, the documents trembling in her lap, and let the tears come. Not the quiet, controlled tears she had permitted herself at the funeral. These were different, raw, the kind that come from the center of the chest and shake the whole body, the kind you only cry when you are alone in a hole in the ground with the voice of your dead father still ringing in the air. He had not forgotten her. He had never forgotten her. Every silence, every distance, every moment she had mistaken for abandonment had been strategy. He had been building a wall between her inheritance and the people who wanted to steal it, and he had built it so quietly that no one heard a thing. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, gathered the documents into the box, and climbed back up the stairs. The barn was gray with early dawn. She sealed the trap door, pushed the crates back over it, and sat on the floor with her back against the wall, the box on her knees, watching light creep through the gaps in the roof. For 3 days, she said nothing. She returned to the barn each morning, sorted through the files, read every document twice. She was careful. She did not tell anyone what she had found. She did not call a lawyer. She did not confront Vivian. She waited. On the 4th day, she came back to find the barn door hanging open. She had locked it. She was certain. The padlock she had bought at the hardware store in town was gone, the hasp bent outward as though someone had pried it with a crowbar. Inside, the hay bales she had restacked were scattered. The tool bench was overturned. Feed sacks had been torn open and emptied across the floor. Someone had searched the barn. She ran to the back corner. The crates were still in place. The trap door was still sealed. Whoever had come had not found the chamber. But the shelves along the wall where she had left a few of the less important files while sorting were empty. Papers she had set aside, old receipts and harvest logs, were gone. Her blood went cold. Vivian. It had to be Vivian. The woman had seen Alara coming and going from the barn, had perhaps noticed the new lock on the door, and had decided to investigate. She had not found the real prize, but she had found enough to know that something was hidden here. Enough to escalate. Alara stood in the wreckage of the barn, breathing hard, fear and fury tangled together in her chest. For a moment, a terrible moment, she considered walking away. Letting them have it all. The mansion, the vineyard, the company. Let Vivian win. Let Dorian laugh. Let the valley forget that Henry Cole ever had a daughter who carried his initials on her heart. The moment lasted 3 seconds. Then she looked at the beam. HC plus EC, the letters were still there, carved deep, untouched by whoever had ransacked the barn. Her father had put them there for a reason, not as decoration, as a reminder. We are a team, no matter what happens out there. She set her jaw, picked up the overturned tool bench, set it right. brushed the dirt from her knees. Then she got to work. That afternoon, she drove to the print shop in town and copied every document from the underground chamber. Every certificate, every trust agreement, every page of every folder. She paid in cash. She spoke to no one. She placed one complete set in a safe deposit box at the First National Bank on Main Street, signed for it in her own name, and kept the originals in a waterproof bag she carried in her car at all times. No lawyer, no ally, no one to betray her or hesitate or compromise. Just Alara and the evidence and the quiet, stubborn certainty that her father had built this path for her to walk alone. That evening, her phone rang. The number was Beckett's. She almost did not answer. But something instinct or curiosity or the memory of that guilty glance at the funeral made her press the green button. His voice was low and hurried, not friendly, afraid. Mom hired people to survey the land around the barn. She is talking about contesting the deed, saying the property was never properly transferred. You should be careful. A pause. That is all I can tell you. He hung up. No promise, no allegiance. Just a warning tossed from the deck of a sinking ship by a man who could see the water rising, but was not ready to swim. Alara set the phone down and stared at the wall. The clock ticked. Outside, the Virginia evening was turning purple. At the edges, the mountains going dark against the sky. Time was running out. Vivian was moving. Pembroke was in her pocket. And the only person standing between the truth and its burial was a 28-year-old school teacher, sitting alone in a rented room with a box of papers and a brass key. She opened her laptop. For the next 5 hours, she did not move. She read Virginia corporate law until her eyes burned. She studied the process for verifying shareholder records with the State Corporation Commission. She found phone numbers, filing procedures, precedent cases. She took notes in a spiral notebook, filling page after page in handwriting that she realized with the pain, though, looked more like her father's than she had ever noticed. At 11 the next morning, she called the Virginia State Corporation Commission. The hold music played for 9 minutes. When the clerk answered, Alara gave the company name and registration number, read directly from the certificate. One moment the clerk said, keys clicking, then the answer. Simple, official, final. Cole Holdings, LLC. Registered April 14th, 2009. Principal shareholder, Alara Marie Cole. 62% controlling interest. Status active and in good standing. Alara closed her eyes. She had everything she needed. That afternoon, she picked up her phone and dialed the number on Pembroke's business card. The receptionist answered on the second ring. I would like to schedule a meeting with Mr. Pembroke in the Cole family, Alara said. Her voice was calm, steady. The voice of a woman who had spent 3 weeks sweeping floors and reading documents and sitting alone in the dark and had come out the other side with something harder than grief. Regarding what matter, the receptionist asked. Regarding the ownership of Cole Holdings, Alara said. Tell them I will be there Monday morning, 10 o'clock. She hung up. The barn stood quiet in the afternoon sun, its shadow stretching long across the field. Inside, the crates covered the trap door. The beam held its carved initials. The key sat heavy in her pocket. She had walked into this barn with nothing but a crumpled deed and a broken broom. She was walking out with the truth. And on Monday, she would make them hear it. Monday came the way justice comes, slowly and then all at once. Alara woke before dawn. The sky outside her window was the color of iron heavy, and still the kind of morning that holds its breath before a storm. She showered, dressed in a simple black blouse and gray slacks. Nothing expensive, nothing borrowed, just clean and steady, the way her father would have dressed for a day that mattered. She picked up the leather satchel from the chair beside the bed. It was her father's. She had found it in the barn on the first day of cleaning, shoved behind the tool bench with dust in its seams and a faint smell of pipe tobacco still clinging to the lining. She had cleaned it, conditioned the leather with oil she bought at the hardware store, and now it held every document that would decide the rest of her life. She did not eat breakfast. Her stomach would not allow it. Instead, she drank black coffee, standing at the counter, watching the first gray light touch the mountains through the kitchen window. The valley was quiet. The world did not know what was coming, but she did. The drive to Richmond took an hour and 40 minutes. She did not turn on the radio. She did not make phone calls. She drove in silence, both hands on the wheel, the satchel on the passenger seat where the crumpled deed had sat 3 weeks ago. The same seat, a different document, a different woman. The law office of Pembroke and Associates occupied the third floor of a stone building on Gray Street, the kind of building that announced seriousness with its architecture alone. Tall windows, dark wood, the name etched in brass beside the door. Alara parked on the street, fed the meter, and stood on the sidewalk for a moment looking up at the windows. Somewhere behind that glass, Vivian was already seated, already confident, already certain that this meeting would end the way every meeting ended, with Alara quiet and defeated and small. Alara tightened her grip on the satchel strap and walked inside. The conference room was long and narrow-paneled in dark walnut, with a table polished to the kind of shine that makes you afraid to set anything on it. Vivian sat at the center of the far side, flanked by her attorneys, two men in charcoal suits with matching expressions of professional indifference. Pembroke sat to her right, his wire-rimmed glasses catching the overhead light. Dorian was beside his mother, arms folded, jaw set, wearing the look of a man who considered this an inconvenience beneath his attention. Beckett sat at the end of the table, slightly apart from the rest, his hands flat on the wood, his eyes on the door. When Alara entered the room, did not exactly fall silent. It shifted. The conversation did not stop so much as it redirected the way water moves around a stone. Dorian glanced at her and then away. One of the attorneys checked his watch. Vivian looked at her the way you look at a stain on a tablecloth, with brief irritation and the certainty that it would be dealt with. Miss Cole, Pembroke said, gesturing to the single chair on the opposite side of the table. "Thank you for coming. Please sit." She sat. She placed the satchel on the table in front of her. She did not open it. Pembroke adjusted his glasses. "We understand you have some concerns regarding the estate distribution. Mrs. Cole has graciously agreed to hear them, and we are prepared to discuss a reasonable resolution." Vivian leaned forward slightly. "We thought perhaps you might want to discuss the barn property," she said, her voice warm and careful, the voice of a woman who had spent decades turning condescension into an art form. "If maintaining it is a burden, the family would be willing to purchase the land from you. At a fair price, of course." Dorian smirked. "Very fair," he echoed. Alara looked at them. She looked at each face in turn. Vivian's polished calm, Dorian's smirk, Pembroke's professional mask, Beckett's lowered eyes. She took her time. She let the silence build until it pressed against the walls. Then she spoke. "I am not here to sell the barn." Pembroke blinked. "I am sorry." She unlatched the satchel. The click of the brass clasp was the only sound in the room. "I am here to discuss ownership," she said. "Not of the barn, of everything." She reached into the satchel and drew out the first document. She laid it on the table with the careful precision of a woman placing a card in a game she had already won. Certificate of Incorporation. Cole Holdings, LLC, filed with the Virginia State Corporation Commission, April 14, 2009. She slid it forward. Then the second. Trust agreement, irrevocable. Establishing Cole Holdings as the controlling entity for all Cole family assets, including real estate vehicles, investment accounts, and business operations. Then the third. Shareholder registration. Principal shareholder Alara Marie Cole. 62% controlling interest. She placed each page on the polished wood like laying stones in a wall, one by one, slowly enough for every person at the table to see the stamps, the signatures, the raised blue seals of notary offices and state agencies. The room changed. She could feel it happening the way you feel the pressure drop before a storm. The air thinned. The smirk slid off Dorian's face. One of the attorneys leaned forward, his professional indifference cracking at the edges. Pembroke reached for the nearest document and held it close to his glasses, his lips moving silently as he read. Vivian did not move, but the color left her face in a slow, steady drain, like water pulling back from a shore. "This is absurd," she said. Her voice was still controlled, but the edges had sharpened. "These are forged." Alara reached into the satchel one final time and placed a single printed page on the table. A certified statement from the Virginia State Corporation Commission issued 3 days ago, confirming the registration, the shareholder structure, and the active status of Cole Holdings, LLC. "They are not forged," Alara said. "These are the original filings. Your own attorney can verify them." "I already have." Pembroke set the document down. His hand was not steady. He looked at Vivian, then at the attorneys, then back at the papers, as though hoping they might rearrange themselves into something less catastrophic. "I will need to make a call," he said. He stepped out. The room held its breath. Vivian sat perfectly still, her hands folded on the table, but her knuckles had gone white. Dorian's arms were no longer crossed. They hung at his sides, and his jaw had loosened, not in relaxation, but in the slow, visible way that shock takes hold of a body before the mind catches up. Beckett was the only one who looked at Alara directly. His expression was not surprise. It was recognition. The look of a man who had suspected the floor was hollow, but had never been brave enough to knock. Pembroke returned. He did not sit down. He stood at the head of the table and spoke in the careful, measured voice of a man delivering news he wished belonged to someone else. "I have confirmed with the State Corporation Commission," he said. "Cole Holdings, LLC, is registered and active. Miss Alara Cole is listed as the principal shareholder with controlling interest. The company's asset structure indicates that all properties currently held by the Cole family, including the primary residence, the vineyard, and all associated holdings, are owned by the corporation, not by individuals." He paused, swallowed. "Legally speaking, Miss Cole holds the controlling interest in the entirety of the Cole estate." The silence that followed was not the silence of a room absorbing information. It was the silence of a room whose foundation had just shifted beneath it. Dorian stood. His chair shot backward and struck the wall. "You cannot be serious," he said. His voice was loud, too loud for the room cracking at the edges. "She is not even—" He stopped. The word hung in the air, unfinished but unmistakable. Every person at the table heard what he did not say. Alara looked at him, straight, steady, without blinking. Not even what she asked quietly. The room froze. Dorian faltered. His eyes cut to his mother, looking for the cue, the instruction, the rescue she had always provided. But Vivian said nothing. She sat in her chair with one hand pressed to her forehead, trembling, and for the first time in Alara's memory, she had no words prepared. Then Beckett stood. He did not stand quickly or dramatically. He rose the way a man rises when he has been sitting in the wrong chair for a very long time and has finally decided to move. He pushed his chair back, stepped away from his mother's side of the table, walked around the end, and stood beside Alara. "Enough, Mom," he said. His voice was low, almost gentle, the voice of someone too tired to shout. "Just enough." Vivian looked at her younger son. Something passed between them, fast and silent, a whole history compressed into a single glance. Then she looked away. Alara gathered the documents. Her hands were calm, her pulse was steady. The hum of the air conditioning filled the silence like white noise. "I am not here to take your home," she said. She looked at Dorian, whose face had gone the color of raw clay. She looked at Beckett, who stood beside her like a man who had just stepped off a ledge and found solid ground. She looked at Vivian, whose empire of careful manipulation was dissolving in real time behind her eyes. "But this family stops being your stage today," she said to Vivian. Vivian's face twisted, fury and humiliation and something older, something buried, something she would never name. "You will regret crossing me," she said. Alara stood. "I already did," she replied, "every time I stayed quiet." She turned and walked toward the door, her shoes clicking against the marble floor, in a rhythm that sounded even to her own ears like punctuation at the end of a long and terrible sentence. As she reached the doorway, Pembroke's voice stopped her. Quiet, almost respectful. "Miss Cole, your father would be proud." She paused, did not turn around, nodded once, and walked into the light. She did not go home. She did not go to the rental. She drove straight back to the valley, back to the barn, and arrived as the afternoon was giving way to evening, the sky streaked in shades of amber and gray. The barn door was still broken from the break-in. She had not fixed it yet. She pushed it open and stood in the entrance, breathing in the familiar air, letting the silence settle over her like water. The victory in the conference room had been real, but it had left her feeling hollowed out, not triumphant. She had won the argument. She had not yet found the ending. She climbed down the stairs to the underground chamber. Her flashlight moved across the shelves, past the boxes she had already emptied, past the harvest logs and company records, until it landed on something she had noticed days ago, but had not yet opened. A single envelope tucked behind the last metal box on the lowest shelf, pressed against the dirt wall, as though someone had placed it there last. It was not sealed with a clasp or a stamp. It was sealed with a strip of tape, the kind her father used to close seed packets. And on the front, in his handwriting, smaller and less steady than the labels on the other boxes, was a single line. "For Alara, when it is over." She sat on the crate, the same crate where she had listened to his voice on the tape recorder. She peeled the tape, carefully opened the flap, and drew out 2 sheets of paper folded, once written on both sides. His handwriting filled the pages the way his voice had filled the recording. Not rushed, not formal, just honest. The way he talked when it was the two of them and no one else was listening. The letter began without greeting. "I've been writing this in my head for years. I suppose I always knew it would end up on paper eventually. I want you to understand something about Vivian. I loved her once, truly. Not the way I loved your mother, which was the love of youth and faith and not knowing any better. I loved Vivian the way a man loves someone who makes the loneliness stop. After your mother passed, the silence in this house was louder than anything I had ever heard. Vivian walked in, and the noise came back. Laughter, conversation, the sound of footsteps in rooms that had been empty too long. I mistook relief for love. By the time I understood the difference, I had already signed half my life over to her. She did not come for me, Alara. She came for what I built. I saw it clearly about 8 years into the marriage. Small things at first. Questions about the accounts that were too specific. Conversations with Pembroke that stopped when I entered the room. Documents I did not remember signing. She was patient. I will give her that. She moved slowly the way water moves through rock, and by the time I understood what was happening, she had already rerouted the river. But I am a farmer's grandson, and farmers know one thing better than anyone. You do not fight the flood. You build on higher ground. Cole Holdings was my higher ground. I built it quietly with a lawyer Vivian never met, in an office she never visited, under the name of the only person I trusted completely. You. You were 13 when I filed the papers. You did not know. I could not tell you. If Vivian ever suspected, she would have found a way to unravel it before the ink was dry. So I buried it in the barn, in the one place she considered worthless, in the one place she would never look. I am not proud of the deception, but I am proud of what it protected. Alara turned the page. The handwriting here was slightly less steady. He had written this part later, she realized, closer to the end. "I need to tell you something I should have said out loud every day for 20 years. You are the best thing I ever built. Not the company, not the land, not the barns or the fences or the fields. You, every time I watched you walk through that door with dirt on your shoes and a question in your eyes, I knew that everything I had done, every acre I had cleared, every deal I had made, every quiet night I had spent in that chamber beneath the floor, all of it had a reason, and the reason was you. I know I was not always there the way I should have been. I know Vivian pushed you to the edges of this family, and I let it happen more than I should have. I told myself I was playing a long game, that the protection I was building in secret was worth the distance it cost in the open. Maybe it was. Maybe it was not. That is for you to judge, not me. But I need you to know this. You did not inherit a company, Alara. You inherited the way I see the world. You inherited the belief that what matters most is not what you own, but what you protect. And I protected you in the only way I knew how, with dirt and paperwork and a brass key hidden under our initials. I hope it was enough. I hope you found this in time. And I hope when you stand in that barn and look around, you see what I always saw. Not a building, not an inheritance, a promise that the things we love survive us, that the truth buried deep enough outlasts every lie built on top of it. I love you, sweetheart. I always have. I always will. Dad. Alara set the letter down on the crate. She did not fold it. She sat very still, both hands flat on her knees, and stared at the dirt wall in front of her. The flashlight cast a pale circle on the earth, motionless, like a single unblinking eye. She did not cry the way she had when she first heard his voice on the tape. That grief had been sharp, sudden, a wound torn open. This was different. This was the slow, deep ache of a wound finally closing, of understanding arriving not as a shock, but as a tide filling every empty space she had carried since the day he died. He had seen her. Through all of it, the distance, the silence, the years of standing at the edge of a family that treated her like a guest in her own father's house, he had seen her, and he had built beam by beam, document by document, a world in which she would be safe. Not because he was perfect. He said so himself. Because he loved her in the way that mattered most. With action, with patience, with the quiet faith that she would find her way to the truth when the time came. She picked up the letter, held it against her chest for a moment, then slipped it into the inside pocket of her jacket, close to her heart, where the brass key had once rested. Then she climbed the stairs, sealed the trap door, and walked out of the barn into the last light of evening. The story moved through the valley the way stories do in small towns. Not through headlines, but through voices. Someone at the law office told someone at the courthouse, who told someone at the diner, who told someone at the feed store. By sundown, every kitchen table in the valley had a version of the same tale. Henry Cole's daughter, the barn, the secret, the turning of the tide. Vivian filed for appeal within the week. It went nowhere. The documents were ironclad, filed by a man who had spent years building a case against the very people he lived with, a man who loved his daughter enough to wage a silent war on her behalf and never say a word. The court reviewed the filings, confirmed the registrations, and issued its ruling in language that left no room for interpretation. Alara Marie Cole, principal shareholder of Cole Holdings, LLC, retained full ownership and controlling interest of all assets held by the corporation. The mansion, the vineyard, the cars, the accounts, the land. Every piece of the Cole empire that Vivian had spent 2 decades positioning herself to inherit now rested in the hands of the one person she had spent those same 2 decades pushing to the margins. Vivian left the valley 6 weeks later. She did not say goodbye. She packed 2 suitcases and a car full of personal items and drove north without looking back. Some said she went to her sister in Connecticut. Others said she simply disappeared the way people do when the story they have been telling about themselves turns out to be fiction. Alara did not chase her, did not gloat, did not issue statements or give interviews. When a reporter from the county paper called, she said only one sentence. My father built something worth protecting. I intend to honor that. She let Dorian and Beckett keep their rooms in the main house. She did not evict them. She did not humiliate them. She simply changed the locks on the office, hired a new attorney, and began the long, patient work of understanding the company her father had entrusted to her. Dorian left on his own within a month. He could not stand it living in a house that belonged to the sister he had laughed at walking on floors that were no longer his. He moved to Charlotte, took a job in commercial real estate, and never called. Beckett stayed. He did not say much at first. He worked on the property, fixed fences, cleared brush, helped paint the barn when Alara decided to restore it. They did not talk about the will reading or the conference room or the years of silence. They worked, and in the working something grew between them that had never had room to grow before. Not friendship exactly, something older, something closer to the bond between two people who survived the same flood and found themselves standing on the same dry ground. One afternoon, a few weeks after the court's final ruling, Beckett drove up to the barn with a small box in the passenger seat. He handed it to Alara without ceremony. She opened it. Inside, lying on a fold of dark velvet, was a pocket watch. Gold. Scratched. The kind of watch a man carries for 50 years until the weight of it becomes part of his hand. She knew it instantly, her father's. He had worn it every day of her childhood, clipped to his belt loop, the chain catching the light when he bent to pick her up. Mom told everyone he lost it, Beckett said quietly. He did not lose it. He hid it. Same as everything else. Guess he just did not trust her with it. Alara turned the watch over. On the back, engraved in small, clean letters, were two words. For Alara. She closed her hand around it. The metal was warm, as though someone had just been holding it. He trusted time, she said. To show the truth, Beckett nodded. They stood in silence for a moment, the wind brushing through the tall grass around the barn, the afternoon light turning the fields to gold. Then he walked back to his car and drove away, and she watched until the dust settled and the road was empty, and the only sound was the ticking in her hand. That evening, she sat on the steps of the barn, the same steps where her father used to drink his coffee at sunrise, watching the valley wake up. The air smelled of wet earth and fresh paint and hay, the old scent and the new one mixed together like a conversation between what was and what would be. She held the pocket watch in her palm. Its face was cracked in one corner, but the hand still moved steady and sure, marking seconds that no one would get back, but that no one could take away. She thought about the funeral, the second row, the laughter, the crumpled deed. She thought about the broom with the cracked handle and the dust that rose in the flashlight beam. She thought about the crack in the concrete and the stairs going down into the dark, and the sound of her father's voice on a tape recorder saying the words she had waited her whole life to hear. I am proud of you, Alara. She thought about the letter, the pages pressed against her heart, the confession of a man who had loved imperfectly but completely, who had made mistakes he admitted and built protections he never explained, who had trusted his daughter with everything he had because she was the one person who understood that some things matter more than money. She looked out across the valley. The sun was setting behind the Blue Ridge, and the light was doing what it always does at that hour in the Shenandoah, turning everything it touches into something that looks like memory. The fields burned gold. The river flashed silver through the trees. The barn behind her cast a long shadow that reached all the way to the farmhouse on the hill, connecting the two places like a hand extended across a distance that had once seemed impossible to cross. He did not leave me a barn, she said softly to no one and to everyone. He left me proof that love outlives greed. Somewhere in the valley, thunder rolled, not the sharp crack of a storm arriving, but the low, long sound of one passing, moving east over the mountains, leaving clean air and silence in its wake. The barn doors shifted gently in the wind. One creaked open, the other eased closed, like breathing, like something old and patient settling into rest after a long watch. Alara slipped the pocket watch into her coat and stood. The evening air was cool on her face. The first stars were appearing above the ridge line, faint but certain, the way her father had taught her to find them 20 years ago from the roof of this very barn. She looked up, counted 3, smiled. Then she turned and walked inside, and the door swung shut behind her, closing on the past and opening somewhere in the warm dark to everything that lay ahead.